Let me take you back to a time when love letters were more dangerous than they were romantic. A time when holding hands before marriage could ruin a woman's reputation forever. Welcome to Victorian England, the golden age of etiquette, repression, and deeply frustrating dating rituals. Imagine you're a young woman in London in the year 1857. You're 19, come from a respectable middle-class family, and you've just been told not ask that it's time to start thinking about marriage. You've spent your whole life preparing for this moment. Your education has been limited to piano lessons, French conversation, embroidery, and just enough reading to make you interesting but not opinionated. You've been raised to be agreeable, polite, and above all, presentable. And now, you're being carefully positioned like a chess piece in a game you didn't design. You're not told to consider love. That would be naive. You're not told to consider attraction or compatibility or the possibility of companionship. None of that is relevant. What matters is marrying well, which means marrying up if at all possible, and if not up, then at the very least not down. Because marrying down would reflect poorly on your family, and social standing is a fragile thing. So your parents begin to arrange outings where you'll be seen, not to enjoy yourself, but to be noticed, evaluated, and, if fortune smiles, pursued. In essence, the entire system of Victorian romance is designed less like a journey of emotional connection and more like a carefully structured business transaction, complete with corsets, gloves, calling cards, and deeply rehearsed manners. You're not searching for a soulmate. You're negotiating your future, quietly competing with other young women for limited positions in the marriage market. And while you're putting on your best smile at a garden party or sipping weak tea in a drawing room, your family is already calculating. Does he come from a good family? How much is his income? Is there an estate? Any scandals in the lineage? Victorian dating, or what they formerly called courtship, wasn't just complicated. It was emotionally draining. It was structured like a ceremony, conducted under constant surveillance with every gesture loaded with meaning. First and foremost, it wasn't something you did freely. You couldn't stroll through Hyde Park and strike up a conversation with someone intriguing. You couldn't smile at a man across the room unless he had already been introduced to you formally by someone of suitable status. Doing so otherwise wasn't just rude. It was dangerous. Every single interaction between an unmarried man and woman was regulated by an invisible set of social laws. These weren't just casual expectations or gentle suggestions. They were strict, unspoken codes that could literally shape your future. One wrong move, a glance held too long, a letter sent too soon, a word whispered out of place could lead to whispered gossip, social exclusion, or worse, permanent damage to your reputation. And a damaged reputation, especially for a woman, was something society rarely forgave. Now consider the chaperone. She was both your shield and your shackle. A young woman was almost never allowed to be alone in the company of a man who wasn't a relative. Privacy, intimacy, or spontaneity were considered suspicious. If you were seen walking with a man unaccompanied even in daylight, even in public, tongues would wag. And if people talked, reputations could crack like porcelain. So every romantic interaction had a third presence, usually an older female relative, like an aunt or a family friend, whose job was to enforce propriety. She would sit near you during conversations, subtly monitor your expressions, and interrupt if your laughter lingered too long. Her presence ensured that things stayed appropriate, which meant no lingering looks, no personal questions, no impassioned tones, and certainly no touching. Physical contact was not just discouraged, it was nearly forbidden. Even a gentleman offering his hand to help a lady into a carriage had to do so with extreme care, barely brushing her gloved fingers, never looking her directly in the eye, and always maintaining an air of detachment. Anything more suggestive could be interpreted as improper, or worse, as a declaration of romantic intent. And that was the paradox of it all. You were expected to be charming but not flirtatious, warm but not intimate, visible but never bold. A young woman had to walk a razor-thin line between being desirable and being respectable. Too quiet, and you were dismissed as dull. Too lively, and you were branded fast. For many women, this dance was not only confusing, it was suffocating. You might develop feelings for someone, but expressing them too openly could ruin everything. The only safe way to signal interest was through carefully rehearsed cues. The arch of an eyebrow, the tilt of a fan, the subtle angle of your posture. There was, in fact, an entire codified language of the fan, in which every movement conveyed meaning. If you held your fan with your left hand in front of your face, you were signaling that you were single. If you dropped it, you were indicating interest. Fanning quickly, you were agitated, slowly, disappointed. One misstep, even a fan flick out of place, could confuse or offend. And it wasn't just women who were constrained. Men were expected to behave with measured reserve and moral integrity, at least publicly. They were supposed to court respectfully, never rushing, never appearing too eager. A gentleman who appeared to be too forward could be accused of trying to compromise a lady, and that accusation, even if unfounded, could destroy both lives. And yet, despite all this choreography and control, young hearts did what young hearts have always done. They longed. They hoped. They fell in love in stolen glances and brief exchanges, in the pages of secret letters, and in the quiet agony of not knowing whether a look was returned. But in the Victorian world, almost none of that longing could be spoken aloud. Courtship was a cage lined with velvet. It might have looked elegant from the outside, but inside it was tight, guarded, and deeply lonely. Now let's say you were actually interested in someone. Maybe you met at a tea party. He was polite, well-dressed, attentive without being forward. He asked about your piano playing, complimented your embroidery, nothing overt, just the kind of practiced small talk that hinted at deeper interest. And somehow, despite all the layers of protocol and watchful eyes, you felt something. A flicker, a possibility. But how on earth were you supposed to let him know? You couldn't just send him a note. That would be shockingly inappropriate unless you were already formally acquainted, and even then your letter would have to be brief, vague, and channeled through a third party to maintain propriety. You couldn't approach him directly either. That would not only break etiquette, it would mark you as bold, and boldness was not a virtue in Victorian courtship. It was practically a scandal. So instead, you had to be subtle, impossibly subtle. The Victorians were connoisseurs of coded behavior. Everything meant something. Every movement was intentional. Every glance was carefully timed. And one of the most iconic tools of this hidden dialogue was the handheld fan. At first glance, it was just an accessory, lace-edged, ivory-handled, often beautifully painted. But in reality, it was a secret instrument of communication. The way you held it, the way you moved it, when and how you opened or closed it, all of it formed part of a silent language that only the socially literate could decode. Holding your fan with your right hand in front of your face might mean "follow me," placing it on your left ear. "I want to get rid of you," slowly drawing it across your cheek. "I love you." Even something as simple as letting it rest on your right cheek signaled yes, while the left cheek meant no. This was not just for show. Misreading a fan's gesture could be disastrous. If a man thought you were inviting him to approach when you were actually brushing him off, it could create embarrassment, or worse, a public misunderstanding that could follow you for years. And if you, as a woman, were too obvious, too bold with your signals, you ran the risk of being seen as improper, indecent, or even desperate. The pressure was relentless. If a man proposed and was rejected, the emotional blow could be profound, but socially he might recover. A bruised ego, perhaps a bit of gossip, but life would go on. For women, however, the stakes were infinitely higher. If she turned a suitor down, she risked not receiving another offer. But if she seemed too eager, too quick to respond to flirtation, too enthusiastic in conversation, her character might come under scrutiny. She might be whispered about, judged, dismissed. Everything was a performance, a balancing act between approachability and modesty, between charm and restraint. You had to express interest without seeming like you were trying to express interest. And this balancing act was not only exhausting, it was critical. Because for many women, their entire future rested on the outcome. It's hard to overstate just how high the stakes were, especially for women of a certain class. Marriage wasn't just a life milestone. It was a financial strategy, a social necessity, and in many cases, a survival mechanism. A respectable woman couldn't inherit property. She couldn't vote. She couldn't access most forms of employment. Her options were brutally limited. If her father died and she remained unmarried, she could be left penniless, dependent on the charity of distant relatives or forced into a governess position, which, though respectable, was hardly secure and rarely desirable. If she didn't marry young ideally by her early 20s, she risked being labeled a spinster. That term may sound quaint today, but in Victorian England it carried enormous weight. It was synonymous with failure. Not a personal failure, mind you, but a social one. A woman who wasn't married by a certain age was seen as having been passed over, as if her value had diminished with each passing year. People pitied her. They joked about her. She became a cautionary tale, the quiet aunt in the corner at family gatherings, the one with the tightly pinned hair and the slightly wistful gaze. Men, of course, operated under a different set of expectations. While their reputations mattered, their social value wasn't entirely wrapped up in marriage. They could afford to wait. In fact, it was often considered wise for a man to establish himself professionally before settling down. A gentleman in his 30s who remained unmarried might be seen as focused or discerning. He might be praised for his ambition, his intellect, his worldly experience. No one rushed him. No one questioned his worth based on his marital status. But that didn't mean men had it easy either. The expectations placed on them were just different. They were expected to initiate courtship, to demonstrate both interest and restraint, and to walk a tightrope between passion and decorum. A man had to prove his intentions were honorable, his finances stable, his background respectable. He had to impress not only the woman, but her entire family, sometimes even her extended social circle. And if he came from a lesser class or lacked a suitable income, he was often discouraged from pursuing a match at all. Because just like women were expected to marry up, men were warned against marrying down. Love, in this context, was a secondary concern. The primary concern was always suitability, a word that encompassed wealth, name, manners, and reputation, but rarely emotion. So, whether you were a young woman trying to catch someone's eye with a flick of your fan, or a young man rehearsing your lines before calling at the parlor, courtship in Victorian England was not a light-hearted affair. It was tense, structured, and endlessly performative. Every interaction mattered. Every moment had consequences. And beneath the surface of every polite conversation, every exchanged glance, was a quiet storm of nerves, calculations, and unspoken hopes. Let's talk about class, the invisible but ever-present force that shaped every corner of Victorian life, especially when it came to romance. Victorian society was built like a ladder that you were never meant to climb. You were born into your rung, and that was where you were expected to stay. This rigid hierarchy didn't just define where you lived or how much money you had. It defined who you could speak to, what you could wear, where you could be seen, and most importantly, who you could marry. If you were upper class, the child of landed gentry, aristocrats, or wealthy industrialists, your romantic options were limited not by feelings, but by status. You didn't marry the person you loved. You married the person who matched your family's name, land, income, and reputation. A duke, for example, might enjoy the flattery of a pretty shopkeeper's daughter, but he certainly wouldn't be allowed to marry her, not without risking social suicide. Marrying below one's class was not just frowned upon. It was considered a scandal, even a betrayal of your lineage. A nobleman who married beneath him might find himself quietly excluded from elite dinner parties. His wife might never be invited to court. His children might be dismissed as improperly bred. For women, the punishment could be far worse. A lady who pursued a romance with a man of lower status could be cast out by her own family, lose access to her dowry, and be marked with that infamous label ruined. That word, ruined, carried a brutal finality in the Victorian world. It didn't just mean embarrassment. It meant you were done, finished, no longer respectable, no longer marriageable. And yet the heart is rarely obedient. Secret romances did happen. They happened more than you'd think. A glance exchanged between a viscount and a housemaid. A late-night letter slipped through the back gate. Meetings in moonlit gardens or on staircases just out of earshot. The danger of these relationships was part of their thrill and their tragedy, because if a couple was discovered, the consequences were swift and severe. The woman would almost always bear the brunt. She might be disowned, dismissed from service, or hidden away by her family until the scandal faded if it ever did. But class didn't only dictate who you were allowed to love. It also determined how much say you had in your own romantic fate, especially if you were a woman. Even in the most respectable families, where daughters were treated with affection and given fine clothes, their futures were rarely their own. Courtship might look like a choice on the surface, but behind the polite dances and drawing room conversations, negotiations were already taking place. Fathers and sometimes mothers discussed dowries, land holdings, inheritances, and family alliances with the subtlety of diplomats and the intensity of traders. A marriage proposal wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a contract in the making. And women, they were the centerpiece of the deal and the commodity being exchanged. A dowry, which might include a significant sum of money, a piece of land, or valuable heirlooms, was often paid by the bride's family to the groom or his family. It was meant to compensate him for taking on the financial responsibility of a wife. In less romantic terms, it was a transaction, a father offering a package to make his daughter more appealing in the marriage market. In aristocratic families, especially, marriages were tools of consolidation. Two wealthy houses joining together might combine estates, influence, or political power. And if the families didn't like each other, no matter, as long as the match was beneficial, and if the bride protested. That was unfortunate, but rarely persuasive. Even in middle-class homes, where love was starting to be seen as a more acceptable motivation, daughters often felt enormous pressure to choose wisely, which usually meant choosing someone with steady income, moral character, and a clean social record. A love match was admired only if it also made sense. But the moment it threatened social status, it was deemed irresponsible, immature, or downright shameful. Love, if it came at all, was expected to bloom after marriage, not before. It was something that might grow with time, once duty was fulfilled, once children were born, once the economic arrangement settled. But passion, desire, open affection, these were seen as dangerous, even degrading, especially for women. The ideal Victorian woman was not outspoken. She was not flirtatious. She did not speak of desire even if she felt it. She was modest, composed, and pure, or at least, she was expected to appear that way. A woman who showed too much interest in a man might be seen as aggressive. A woman who spoke too freely about her opinions might be labeled unfeminine. A woman who expressed desire openly, even within an engagement, risked being considered vulgar, unworthy, or worse. Women were taught from a young age to manage their emotions, to conceal them behind soft smiles and polite phrases. They were warned that too much feeling would drive men away, that a real lady never chased, she waited, that love was something to be earned by quiet grace and restrained charm, not claimed through bold action. And yet, beneath the surface of all this control, there were women who longed fiercely, who wrote secret poems, who kept diaries full of unspoken hopes, who watched men ride away from their houses and never return, who went to bed wondering if they would ever be seen as more than someone's daughter, someone's bride, someone's asset. The truth is, Victorian courtship was not built for love. It was built for survival, for social harmony, for maintaining the fragile illusion of propriety in a world obsessed with appearances. Love was a byproduct, a hopeful accident, not the goal. And for every couple that managed to find something real within that system, there were dozens more who lived as strangers under the same roof, joined not by affection, but by obligation. You might think things were different for the lower classes, but while they didn't have drawing rooms and debutante balls, their dating lives were no less complicated. Working-class couples might meet at church events or markets, and there was more flexibility in how they interacted. But they still faced harsh judgment, especially around pregnancy and marriage. If a woman became pregnant out of wedlock, she was often abandoned by her family, left to survive alone in a world with few protections. Illegitimacy was a heavy social burden for both the child and the mother. One of the most intimate and revealing aspects of Victorian dating wasn't found in ballrooms or parlor visits, it was found in ink. Letters. Love letters, to be exact. In a world where open conversation about feelings was discouraged, where public affection was frowned upon, and where even eye contact could be considered too bold, the written word became the only safe space for emotion. And even then, only barely. Love letters were the secret language of the heart. They were handwritten portals into a person's soul, elegant, desperate, cautious, and often brimming with longing. Men, especially, bore the burden of expressing romantic intention. They would spend hours, even days, composing the perfect letter, not just because they wanted to impress, but because every sentence carried risk. A word too strong might be read as presumptuous. A word too mild might seem insincere. The letter had to walk the line between boldness and restraint, sincerity and formality. It was, in its own way, a performance just won with ink instead of manners. Some letters ran pages long, quoting poetry, invoking classical references, or drawing from Shakespeare to make declarations they didn't dare speak aloud. Others were more restrained, careful to leave just enough room for interpretation. The tone of the letter had to match the exact stage of courtship. Too intimate too soon, and it was scandalous. Too distant too long, and the opportunity might slip away. And women, they didn't just read these letters casually. They read them with trembling hands and fluttering hearts, aware that their response or lack of one could change everything. Accepting a letter wasn't just about politeness. It was a signal. In many circles, it was tantamount to accepting courtship. And a reply, especially one written in return, could be interpreted as a promise. In fact, if things progressed to an unofficial or formal engagement, breaking it off wasn't simply awkward. It could become a public and legal affair. Victorian England had a legal mechanism known as the breach of promise to marry. This meant that if a woman accepted a man's proposal, whether through verbal agreement or the written word, and then withdrew, he could take her to court. And men did, publicly. Newspapers would sometimes report these cases, which meant that a woman's private feelings could become the subject of public ridicule. A broken engagement wasn't just a heartbreak. It could ruin reputations, split families, and tarnish any chance of marrying again. For women, especially, the consequences were far more lasting. These legal cases were often humiliating affairs. Witnesses were called to testify about the courtship. Love letters were read aloud in the courtroom. Juries debated not just financial damages, but moral questions. Was the woman truly in love? Did she mislead him? Was she ever serious? In an era obsessed with appearances, nothing was more terrifying than having your private emotions dragged into the light for strangers to judge. And yet, despite the risks, letters remained one of the few ways couples could truly connect. They offered a glimpse into who someone really was, or at least who they wanted to be. Because behind the politeness, the etiquette, and the careful phrasing, there was often something deeply human. Desire, hope, vulnerability, even rebellion. Some couples used letters to build secret romances, ones that defied their families, wishes, or crossed social boundaries. In that sense, a letter wasn't just a tool of courtship. It was an act of quiet resistance. And while letters offered one kind of intimacy, public courtship followed another ritual entirely, none more elaborate than what was known as the season. The season was the social heartbeat of upper-class London. It typically ran from spring to early summer, timed to coincide with the opening of Parliament, which brought wealthy families into the city. During this period, elite society would erupt into a calendar of dazzling balls, formal dinners, horse races, garden parties, and opera nights, all crafted with one primary purpose in mind: to marry off daughters to suitable husbands. Debutantes, young women typically aged 17 to 20, would be presented at court, wearing ornate white gowns, often with 3 ostrich feathers in their hair, symbolizing purity and readiness for marriage. Their official introduction to society marked the start of a tense and relentless campaign. Each evening, they would be escorted to grand events by their families, where they were expected to meet suitors, dance gracefully, and make a memorable but never too daring impression. The ballrooms were breathtaking: crystal chandeliers, wax candles flickering against mirrored walls, an orchestra tuning up in the corner, the scent of perfume, flowers, and candle smoke drifting through the air. And among all this, the careful choreography of courtship. A young woman had to navigate conversation with wit but not sarcasm. She had to seem interested but not too interested. She had to dance just enough to appear popular but never be seen with the same man too often. Even laughter was strategic, charming but not boisterous. It was a performance, night after night. Beneath the gowns and polished manners was a quiet desperation from daughters, hopping to attract someone respectable, and from parents, anxious to secure financial security and social elevation for their families. A good match could change a family's fortunes. A bad one could invite whispers. No one wanted to be the girl who didn't get asked to dance, and no one wanted to be the girl who danced too much. The season, for all its glamour, was not romantic. It was a market. Behind the flirtation and champagne were financial negotiations, whispered agreements between fathers, background checks disguised as polite conversations. The language was all smiles, but the meaning was always practical. How much is his estate worth? How many servants? Are there debts? And for the men it was, is she well bred? Is her dowry sufficient? Does her family have status? And yet, amidst all the calculation, real connections sometimes formed. Couples would sneak glances between dances, trade a book or a flower in passing, or exchange letters under the nose of a disapproving aunt. These quiet moments, small rebellions in a system designed for control, were the only places where genuine feeling could grow. Because despite all the rules, the rituals, and the expectations, people still hoped. They still dreamed of marrying someone who made them laugh, who saw them not just as an asset or a legacy, but as a partner. But for most, that was just a dream, a luxury afforded to the lucky few. For the rest, courtship was a transaction dressed in tulle and candlelight, a series of performances where the wrong move could cost you everything. Perhaps one of the saddest truths about Victorian dating is that so many people married without ever really knowing each other. They were bound by duty, pressure, and sometimes pure survival. A woman might marry simply because she had no other way to leave her family's home. A man might marry because he needed an heir. Love, as we understand it today, based on mutual respect, affection, and emotional connection, was often a luxury, not a given. But not all was gloom. There were rare cases of couples who defied the odds, who wrote each other daring letters in secret, who met under the guise of social calls, who married despite the disapproval of their families. These stories became the stuff of novels and gossip, and they gave people hope that love might be possible even in a world built to prevent it. In the end, dating in Victorian England wasn't just difficult. It was an elaborate performance bound by rules, class expectations, and constant surveillance. For many, it was more about survival than romance. For others, it was a lifelong frustration. And for a lucky few, it was a story of love against all odds. So the next time you complain about awkward first dates, ghosting, or swiping endlessly through apps, remember this. At least you're not being judged by your fan etiquette or worrying about being sued for calling off a relationship. Dating might be tough now, but compared to Victorian England, we've never had it easier.